In 1860, Florence Nightingale heralded the dawn of modern nursing when she established her first nursing school. Inspired by the horrors she had witnessed during the Crimean War, she envisaged nursing as being a way to provide better and safer care for all. 25 years later, a woman would emerge who would be her direct antithesis. Instead of seeing nursing as a way to help people, she used it to gain their trust before taking their lives. In today's episode of Well I Never, we explore the case of Jane Toppan. Jane Toppan was born Honora Kelly to Irish parents in Boston, Massachusetts, at some point during the mid-1850s. As the uncertain birth date may suggest, details about her early life are sparse. What we do know, however, is that her mother Bridget died of tuberculosis when she was very young, leaving her and her two sisters to be raised by their alcoholic father, Peter. Alongside being a heavy drinker, their father was also abusive, with some of his actions bordering on psychotic. One story states that he once tried to sew his own eyelids closed, but there is little evidence of this claim. Whatever his mental state, the poor treatment of his daughters saw the two youngest, Delia and Honora, taken from him in 1860. The pair were then placed in the Boston Female Asylum, which, despite its name, operated as an orphanage. Honora would spend just under 2 years at the orphanage before she was taken on as an indentured servant by a woman named Mrs. Ann Toppan. Indentured servitude involves a person signing a contract to agree to supply labour for a set number of years without salary. In Honora's case, she worked in return for being raised by Mrs. Toppan. Honora would take Anne's last name, but was never formally adopted by her. Despite this, Anne insisted that she also change her first name to something less Gaelic, as she held a deep-seated dislike of the Irish. And thus, Honora Kelly became Jane Toppan. She would spend many years with Anne and Anne's biological daughter Elizabeth, even after being released from her indenture on her 18th birthday. Indeed, she would continue working as a servant, though now receiving pay, even after Anne passed away and Elizabeth got married. It wouldn't be until 1885 that Jane decided it was now time to leave the Toppan household. She also decided that she no longer wished to be a servant, and so enrolled at the Cambridge Hospital's nursing school in 1887. She quickly found herself working many 12-hour days, but she faced them without complaint and often with a smile on her face. This demeanour led to her receiving the nickname Jolly Jane. This image was a far cry from the first time Jane had pursued academia. After leaving the orphanage, she was enrolled in a school but found it difficult to make friends. This was largely down to her penchant for telling tall tales and spreading barbarous falsities about those she disliked. Despite her newfound popularity, Jane still had a habit of spreading gossip about those she disliked, and on at least 2 occasions this led to the subject of her stories being expelled. Her patients, however, were largely spared when it came to Jane's tales, not because she liked them all, but because if she took a dislike to one, she'd simply take the situation into her own hands. You see, while she liked many of those placed in her care, Toppan felt that the older patients were a burden. She would openly state that she thought there was no use in keeping them alive, and so she began to run her own experiments on them. Jane was particularly interested in pharmacology, the science of drugs and their effect on living systems. When left unwatched, she would often administer large amounts of opium to elderly patients and observe how they reacted. While these so-called experiments initially caused illness and sedation, they would soon result in death. Instead of guilt for her actions, the death gave Toppan a sick buzz, and she and the poisonings continued. She began to administer atropine in an effort to elicit a more convulsive reaction and at the same time obfuscate the presence of the opium. It's thought that during her time as a student nurse, Toppan killed at least 12 patients. Others she would bring to the brink of death before nursing them back to health to fool her peers into believing she was a skilled practitioner. Even the patients she liked weren't immune from her twisted ways, as it's thought that she would drug and falsify the records of those she got on well with in an effort to prolong their stays with her. In 1889, Jane's nurse training came to an end, but she still needed to serve an amount of time before she could qualify for a nursing license. To this end, she managed to land a position at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Things started well for Jolly Jane, but the staff at Massachusetts General kept a closer eye on patients and their records than those at Cambridge. On several occasions, Jane's tampering with medical records and the high dosages she was giving to patients was spotted by her superiors. However, instead of suspecting foul play, they simply put it down to ineptitude. During her time at Massachusetts General, a strange new angle to her crimes was first revealed. A patient named Amelia Finney was placed in Toppan's care after an operation. She states that the nurse gave her a sour-tasting drink which caused her to convulse and drift in and out of consciousness. Jane climbed into her bed, stroked her hair and kissed her face while telling Amelia it would all be all right soon. Toppan was then disturbed by someone and fled the scene. Amelia survived but believed her experience to have been some kind of fever dream. Despite her initial bright start at the new hospital, Toppan's reputation among her fellow nurses quickly soured and she was suspected of stealing cash and jewellery. So when she decided to leave the ward without permission on one day in 1890, her bosses seized on the opportunity and dismissed her. After a short stint as a private nurse, Toppan returned to Cambridge Hospital. Once there, she continued her cruel practices, though along with elderly patients, she also attempted to poison a trainee nurse named Mattie Davis. Unlike her previous stint at Cambridge, this time her tendency to give overly high doses and the higher than average death rate of those in her care didn't go unnoticed. Though, as with her time at Massachusetts General, this was put down to incompetence rather than malice, and she was dismissed. As she had not served enough time at either hospital to be awarded her nursing licence, Toppan offered her services as a freelance private nurse instead. The switch proved to be a prosperous one for Jane, and despite numerous claims of her stealing from patients, by 1895 she had become one of the most successful private nurses in Boston. This boom didn't put a stop to her murderous ways. Toppan was now lodging at an address on Wendell Street in Cambridge, along with the landlord, Israel Dunham, and his wife, Lovely. By all accounts, the couple seemed to be well liked, but according to Jane, 83-year-old Israel was feeble and fussy, so he became her next victim. 2 years later, Lovely would meet the same fate. By now, Jane felt untouchable and murder had become second nature, while her victims to this point were people she had no real connection to. Her next murder would be much closer to home. In 1899, she went on vacation, renting a cottage on Cape Cod. This was a regular getaway for Jane, but the reasoning behind her latest visit wasn't just to get some rest and relaxation. This time she had invited her foster sister Elizabeth to stay with her. Elizabeth was delighted at having the opportunity to spend some time with Jenny, Jane's childhood nickname. She was very fond of her and had always seen her as a sister. Jane saw things differently. Growing up, Anne Toppan had never been shy in telling Jane exactly where she stood in the pecking order. Elizabeth was her real daughter, while she would always be the Irish cast-off that was lucky to be there. Although Elizabeth never felt that way, she unknowingly became a symbol of the bitterness and anger Jane felt towards her mother. Several days into her stay at the cottage, Elizabeth suffered what doctors described as an apoplectic stroke, which left her in a coma from which she would never awaken. We can only imagine what Jane may have whispered into her victim's ear as she convulsed. Words of comfort? Or did she seize this moment to voice a lifetime of indignation? You'd be forgiven for thinking that with the death of the last person connecting Jane to her unhappy childhood, her lust for murder may have been satiated. However, you would be wrong. Even before the death of Elizabeth, Jane had been setting her sights on her next victim. Moving further away from her earlier MO of ending the lives of those she saw as serving no use, her next victim's use was all too evident. In fact, it was the reason Jane wanted her gone. Myra Connors was, she believed, good friends with Toppan. She was also the matron of St. John's Episcopal School, a position that provided a good regular wage, an apartment and a maidservant. Jane coveted the job, and so when Myra fell ill, she was quick to offer her services. Unsurprisingly, Myra Connors' condition quickly deteriorated. At her funeral, the murderous nurse played the role of a distraught friend as she spoke to the Dean of St. John's. She explained to him that the timing was particularly tragic, as Myra was planning to take an extended break. In fact, she was going to recommend that Jane stand in for her while she was away. The Dean offered her the role, and after taking a few moments to reflect, Jane said she would accept, stating she owed it to Myra. Her nefarious plan had worked, and she now had the role she had so desired. But it wasn't to last, and she was asked to resign after a year due to her poor management skills. This setback would have left her furious, and woe betide anyone who should dare to get on the wrong side of her. Unfortunately, a woman also named Mattie Davis chose this moment to have a pointed conversation with Toppan. Mattie and her husband Alden owned the cottage on Cape Cod where Jane had murdered her sister. After Elizabeth's death, the couple waived any rent owed for that year. That was in 1899. It was now 1901, and despite her still using the property, Jane was still not paying rent. In an effort to rectify the situation, Mrs. Davis travelled from Bourne to Boston to talk things out face to face. She found Jane boarding with a couple named Eliza and Melvin Beadle. Mattie then had a brief conversation with the nurse before Jane went to fetch her a glass of fizzy water. As she drank it, she may have noticed it had a strange sour flavour. Toppan had laced the water with morphine. She would often use carbonated water to help disguise the taste. When Mrs. Davis took ill, the Beadles allowed her to stay in a spare room. When a doctor arrived to check on her, Toppan took him to one side and explained how the diabetic Mattie had eaten a cake not long after her arrival. With seemingly nothing to be suspicious of, and with a capable nurse already on site, the doctor left Mattie in Toppan's care. The devilish Jane toyed with Mattie, varying the doses of the drugs she gave so as to keep her in a hellish limbo before eventually ending her life. Touched by the care they believed Jane had shown their matriarch during her final days, the Davis family invited her to stay with them. Everything Jane Toppan tried seemingly paid off for her, and she now felt as though she could get away with anything. With this in mind, while staying with the Davis family, she decided to push the envelope even further. It's claimed that she began to start small fires in and around the property, blaming a mysterious stranger she had apparently seen hanging around in the area. Something else she spotted also piqued her interest: a tin of arsenic kept inside a shed. She had never used the potent poison in any of her previous murders, as it was too easy to detect. However, the thought of bringing a new type of pain to her victims would prove too tempting. A new deadly plot was soon afoot. After the death of their mother, the Davis daughters, Genevieve and Minnie, had gathered around to support their elderly father, Alden, and were also staying at the house. Genevieve, in particular, was hit hard by her mother's death. Where most would see a person in need of support, Jane saw an opportunity. To Alden and Minnie, she feigned worry for Genevieve, expressing fear as she had apparently spotted her looking at the tin of arsenic in the shed. With the seeds planted, once again, no one suspected Toppan, when days later, Genevieve died from arsenic poisoning. With the taking of one's own life being a taboo subject at the time, her death was recorded as heart disease. Perhaps hoping to secure the holiday home on Cape Cod permanently, or simply driven by bloodlust, Jane Toppan's efforts to wipe out the Davis family continued. 2 weeks after Genevieve's death, Jane put an end to her father Alden, his death being put down to grief. It would be mere days before Toppan completed the annihilation of the Davis family with the final victim, Minnie. Toppan asked her to sign a piece of paper relieving her of any debt owed for renting the holiday home on Cape Cod. Minnie refused, and her fate was sealed. As a final insult, because the first large dose of morphine Jane had given her left Minnie unable to swallow, she administered the fatal dose via an enema. Doctors put her death down to exhaustion. Despite this, and despite Jane's belief that she was untouchable, the death of an entire family in the space of 40 days was bound to raise suspicion. And so it did, with one man in particular, Minnie's father-in-law, Captain Paul Gibbs. Despite initially being quite taken with Jolly Jane's demeanour, his attitude towards her began to change when he saw Toppan inject something into Minnie during her final days. When he challenged her on this, she fumbled for a response. The incident played on his mind, but he didn't act on it until he was approached by his son, Minnie's husband, Harry, who informed him that on her deathbed, Mary would flinch and seemed panicked whenever Jane drew near. Captain Gibbs wasn't alone in his suspicions. A doctor named Ira Cushing also had his doubts about the deaths. He had seen a bright and sprightly Alden Davis in the days before his death and was perplexed that he had gone downhill so fast. The doctor contacted Captain Gibbs, and the pair used their connections to set an investigation in motion. Soon after, the bodies of Mary and Genevieve were exhumed to be examined, and a detective, John Patterson, was assigned to tail Jolly Jane wherever she went. Now she was finished with the Davis family, Jane returned to the Toppan estate in an effort to place the final pieces of her grand plan into position. The death of Elizabeth had left her husband, Reverend Ormond Brigham, alone and vulnerable. With his wife's death, he had inherited the Toppan estate. This was the ultimate prize for Jane. The unwanted child who was never good enough, finally getting the keys to the castle. With it being unlikely that the property would fall into her hands upon Oromel's death, she would have to use a different approach. This time, she would attempt to seduce Oromel and replace her sister as his wife. While her goal was different, her tactics were the same, and she decided the best way to bond with Oromel would be to comfort him after a loss. And so her next victim was his sister, Edna Bannister, who was visiting at the time. This new approach doesn't seem to have proved too successful, so Jane decided to change tack. She poisoned Oromel, but not in an effort to kill him. No, this time around, she planned to win his affections by nursing him back to health. Once more, however, her advances were rebuffed. Enraged, she threatened to reveal to the town that she was pregnant with his child. This was a lie, and once this approach failed too, she overdosed on morphine. With her experience with the drug, it's likely she would have known how much would need to be taken to prove fatal. This doesn't seem to have been her goal though, and after a short stay in hospital, she was discharged. She then retreated to New Hampshire, where she stayed with a friend to lick her wounds and recover. While she had been trying and failing to woo Oromel, a toxicology report revealed traces of arsenic in Minnie's body. With this discovery, it wasn't long before police moved in to make an arrest. In no time at all, local and then national newspapers jumped on the story. Though Jane had only been charged with the murder of Minnie, journalists dug deep to discover the long string of deaths that Toppan left in her wake and wasted no time at all filling their pages with lists of those who had died, along with wild speculation. Surely this meant case closed, a home run. Sadly, no. When the case went to trial, the prosecution focused on the arsenic that had since been found in both sisters' bodies. However, you'll recall that it's thought that arsenic had only been used in Genevieve's murder. How could it also be found in her sister? Had Toppan slipped up? The answer came when the undertaker who had prepared the sisters' bodies for burial revealed that arsenic was a main ingredient in the embalming fluid he had used. This revelation left the prosecution reeling. The defence were handed another boost when it was revealed that the Davis family doctor, Leonard Latter, had recently passed away. This gave Jane the out of claiming that if he was still alive, his evidence would clear her of any wrongdoing. It would be the man who had initially set the investigation in motion who would inadvertently save the case against Toppan. Frustrated with how things were progressing, Captain Paul Gibbs gave an interview to the Boston Journal. In it, he stated that he thought the prosecutors were underestimating the nurse, believing that she would use such an easily detectable poison such as arsenic. He posited his belief that she had, in fact, used a mixture of morphine and atropine in the murders, and that the motive may have been financial, as $500 Alden Davis had on his person at the time of his death had disappeared. This sparked the investigators and prosecution back into life, and further tests revealed traces of both drugs Captain Gibbs had suspected. A pharmacy owner also came forward, stating he had sold Toppan a large amount of morphine. Now armed with a growing mountain of evidence, the prosecution pushed for a grand jury session to decide if a raft of new charges could be brought against Jolly Jane. The session took place in December 1901, and the jury quickly came to the conclusion that there were grounds for Jane to be indicted on these new charges, which included the murder of Alden Davis. The media storm around the case had not subsided and had, in fact, turned up a face from Jane, or indeed Honora's distant past. The Boston Herald had managed to secure an interview with a woman named Jeanette Snow. She was Jane's biological cousin and revealed all about her troubled childhood, her father's strange ways, and the fact her sister had ended up in an asylum. In January of 1902, lawyer Fred Bixby joined the defence team, and with the case against Toppan growing each day and papers raising many questions about her mental state, he pushed for her to be examined by a team of psychiatrists. In March of that year, that's exactly what happened. Up to this point, Jane was still professing her innocence, though the team of psychiatrists were quick to note that she seemed addicted to telling lies. Over time, the facade started to break down, and Jane not only admitted to 11 murders, but she also revealed that she would get into bed with the dying victims and that she got a thrill from seeing death in their eyes. Jolly Jane was soon declared incurably morally insane. With this diagnosis in hand, the trial was merely superficial. Indeed, Jane appeared chatty and cheerful as it progressed. At the end of the day, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Taunton Asylum. It was only after the trial that Jane's attorney revealed that she had confessed to him that she had committed 31 murders. Jane herself would later reveal to papers, quote, "I have given the alienists and Herbert Parker the names of 31 persons I killed. But, as a matter of fact, I killed many more whose names I cannot recall. I think it would be safe to say I killed at least 100 from the time I became a nurse at a Boston hospital where I killed the first one, until I ended the lives of the Davis family." End quote. Initially, Jane seemed to take to life inside Taunton rather well, perhaps believing she could leave after a few years of good behaviour. This wasn't to be, however, and eventually asylum life began to get to her. She pleaded that she was nothing like the other inhabitants of Taunton. In a letter to psychiatrist Dr. Henry R. Stodman, she wrote, quote, "I don't appear like these other patients. I can read a book intelligently. I don't have bad thoughts, so I don't see where moral degeneracy comes in." End quote. In 1904, perhaps haunted by phantoms from her past, paranoia gripped Toppan, who refused to eat because she feared someone was trying to poison her. She dropped in weight from roughly 200 pounds to around 60, and papers reported that she would soon join her victims in the afterlife. Despite appearing to be at death's door, she soon staged a recovery. Perhaps this had been another of her plans. Jane Toppan would never escape the walls of Taunton, eventually dying there in 1938. Her final years spent as an elderly patient, much like those she had shown such scorn. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, consider becoming a channel member to get access to a few more, along with some other bonuses. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."